Just waiting for the attendees to populate, and we'll get started shortly. Just waiting for the attendees to populate, and we'll get started shortly. I was trying to watch the YouTube live at the same time, but I think everybody heard my voice 2 or 3 times. So I just turned that off, so I won't be able to watch that. We'll get started shortly. Yes, I will share the YouTube link here. Okay. Bonjour, Anine, Tanzi. Mididude me Quaindish Nakaz, Wawashkiji and Dodum, Sudbury and Dinjaba, Anishinaabe Métis Quaindao, Nindawe Maga, Nindog, Ninjujaba, Swan Lake, Temiskaming, and Timmins. Welcome all. I'm Lynn LaValle, Anishinaabe Métis, registered with the Métis Nation of Ontario. I introduce myself and my people and where they're from, particularly because of the cultural fraud we see when opportunities are provided to Indigenous peoples. I've been introducing myself like this for a few years now, not because of everything that's going on currently. My mom, the last names on my mom's side are LaBelle, Lafont, Godin, McIver, LaRock, Swain or Swan, Lilly, Korchesny, David, Guibosh, Carpenter, Chartrand, Roy, and Carrier. And the territories include Rock Lake, Swan Lake, Mariopolis, Ile-de-Bois, Gracefield and Timmins, as well as Sudbury. My dad and many generations are from the Temiskaming region on both sides of the river. The last names there are LaValle, Gauthier, Pepin, Richard, Taylor, McKay, Champagne, Marion, and Blodo. I was born in Sudbury, Ontario, and grew up in Toronto's Regent Park. And currently, I'm an uninvited visitor on the traditional territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island. Welcome all to the second talk on Métis identity. These 2 talks were birthed by Tony Belcourt and Maria Campbell to highlight conversation about Métis identity, relations, and language. The first talk can be viewed on YouTube, and I will put a link in the chat shortly. Our moderator today is Sam Nock, and she's Cree Métis writer who grew up in Treaty 8 territory in Northeast BC. Her family originated from Ile-à-la-Crosse, Saskatchewan. Her family names are Morin, Gardner, Beauvier, and Lafleur. She currently lives on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in Vancouver, BC, where she has been an uninvited visitor for the last 11 years. I want to say some thank yous because I won't say anything at the end, but I want to say merci, miigwech to Maria Campbell and Tony Belcourt and our co-host Athabasca University, Nick Scottowin, Ivy Lalone specifically, and Priscilla Campo, and at X University, Angeline, Brian, Tamina, Katie, and Madeline. We have closed captioning available, and we will be taking questions in the question and answer tab at the below, and our chat will also be open. And I'll take it over to Sam. Miigwech, merci.
Merci, Lynn. Tansi Samnati Kasan, Dasin Kriko Tinia, Magama Fami Sigedawako Tinianin, Kananas Gomintinawa Kakiao, also Kananas Gomintinawa, Masquia Maski, Squamashaski, Egua, Slalototaski. Yeah, I always feel so weird on Zoom. I never know where to look or like what to do. So just, yeah, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Lynn. Thank you for everybody who's behind organizing this. I'm very excited to be the moderator. This is gonna be the most you hear me talk, and then I'll be handing it over. But my name is Sam. Like Lynn said, I grew up in Treaty 8 territory, Northeast BC. My family is originally from Lacrosse or Sigedawak in northern Saskatchewan, but I have been living the last 11 years on Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh territories in Vancouver. I was thinking about what I am bringing as the moderator to this, besides being a young Métis person. I sadly can't say I'm a youth anymore. I'm not a youth anymore. That one's sinking into my eye wrinkles. But I was raised in a very political family. My kukum was president of our local for 16 years. And, you know, it's been messy my entire life, my 30 years. So yeah, I just was born into this and I can't wait to have this conversation. I'm just so grateful. I was listening to Maria and Tony's talk before this one to prepare, and Tony said Métis people have always have big fights and then come together with big hearts. And I think that's such a great way to look at these conversations that we're having about identity and governance and our nationhood, because I have to agree. We don't all agree. In fact, we all disagree quite a bit. But I think along with having big fights, we also have some big dances. And I think that's just really beautiful. We're passionate people. I'm very caffeinated and tend to talk fast, so I'm so sorry if I sound like an auctioneer. Before we begin, and before I introduce our panelists, I do just want to manage some expectations about this conversation, and I just want to be forward about that. Because it's not, Métis politics and Métis identity is very much a hot topic right now. It's very much a tense topic right now. And so I just want to manage the attendees, everyone who's watching, your expectations of what's going to come out of this conversation. I feel like I'm a very youth worker right now, sitting you down. I met with Christy and Molly to discuss their goals and boundaries with this, because I don't want anything going off the rails, and want to make sure that everybody on the panel who organized and also who's attending this does feel cared for and does feel like that I do care about how intense and how emotional and how close to home these things are. And we all agreed that we want to center our own people in this, and we want to step away from centering the whiteness of ethnic frauds, of talking about, you know, I hate saying pretendians, that's not my favorite thing to say, but of like pretendians in this huge conversation that's happening, and actually have conversations about our own governance, about our own nation, and exploring that. So it's not a conversation about who is or who isn't Métis, but a conversation on our nation and on our governance, and how complicated that is. That's a whole big topic right there. And so in this, I do ask you to be mindful of this boundary when you're asking your questions. And just to be very upfront with you, for attendees, I will not be prioritizing questions about pretendians or ethnic frauds or the definition of Métis, just right off the bat. I'm going to tell you that right now. This doesn't mean they won't be brought to the table. I just want you to know that this will not be the dominant topic for this conversation. On that note, just a little bit more housekeeping. I won't be taking questions that are in the chat, so please put them into the Q&A. This is just for my own brain. The chat goes really fast and I can't moderate a conversation and also read it at the same time. So please put your questions in the Q&A. That's the best way to ask your questions. I will humanly try to get to as many, bring as many to the panelists as we have time for, but please ask your questions. Yeah, I think I'm just reading my notes that I wrote very small. And in the spirit of the first conversation that happened with Maria Campbell and Tony Belcourt, which you can go watch on YouTube if you haven't already done it. I highly recommend it. It's beautiful. I teared up many times. So in the spirit of that first conversation and, being our own bosses, I want to open the floor to Molly and Christy to identify themselves. First, I'm going to read both of your bios because that's, the official thing to do. But then I'm opening it to you to really talk about where you're from and how you locate yourself in this. So first, I'm going to read. So I'll read both your bios first. All right, the chat is quiet. Also, for people watching on YouTube, I'm not watching the YouTube chat. I wish I could. I only have 2 eyes, and honestly, neither of those ones are that good. That's why I have glasses. So, so first we have Christy Belcourt, who's Patagosanescu from Manitou Sagahegan, is a visual artist, designer, community organizer, environmentalist, social justice advocate, and avid land-based arts and language learner. Her paintings can be found within many public and permanent collections. I feel so, just like I'm reading Christy Belcourt's bio, this is very strange, across North America. Christy has also organized several large national community-based projects of note, including Walking with Our Sisters, the Willisville Mountain Project, Nimki Ajabegang, and various works done with Onaman Collective. Christy donates the proceeds of her collaborations and awards to Nimki Ajabegang. My Anishinaabe is not great. The year-round Indigenous language and traditional arts camp that she, along with a small group of other people, organize. Molly Swain is an Otimpisiosqueo, born and raised in Treaty 7 and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3 territory, and currently living in Amisquachu, Wasagan on Treaty 6, MNA Region 4, and Nahiaopuat lands. She is a PhD student in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, researching 20th century Métis history and Métis anarchism, which is so cool. She is the co-host of Indigenous feminist science fiction podcast and Land Back Project Métis in Space, as a co-director of Métis in Space Land Trust and co-founder of Free Lands, Free People, an Indigenous-led anti-colonial prairie penal abolition organization. Say that 10 times fast. Molly is keen on total liberation, karaoke, and Star Trek, which are great things to be keen on. So now that we got the formal bios out of the way, I'm going to open it up to Christy first to just tell us who you are, and then Molly.
Hi, everyone. That was great, Sam. Thank you. And if it's weird for you to be reading my bio, think of how weird it is for me to be like listening to my bio. That's always very awkward. But I'm really honored to be here. Hello, everybody. My name is Christy Belcourt, and I'm from a community called Lac Sainte Anne in Alberta. The original name of that place is Manitou Sagahegan, which means Spirit Lake. And I was raised mostly in Ottawa. And I have, well, everybody, I think you already know my dad. If you don't, my dad's Tony Belcourt. My mom's name is Judith Pierce Martin. I have 2 siblings. I'm a mom, I'm an auntie, I'm a granddaughter, I'm a sister, I'm a cousin, I'm a family member, I'm a community member. And that's me. That's where I'm from. I'm from the land, and I'm really happy to be here. So.
Yeah. Okay. Tansei, everybody, Molly's Sigason. Which was going to Sky. As Sam mentioned, I was born and raised in Calgary, now currently very happily living in Edmonton. So as Sam, I guess, also mentioned, I am a PhD student. I study primarily 20th century Métis history. And so I guess first off, I have to say, I feel very privileged and very honored to have been asked to participate in this conversation. Especially, Christy was sort of born and raised in what I consider to be like an absolutely amazing, incredibly inspiring period of our peoplehood that we can learn a lot from. And of course, sort of following in the path laid out for us by Maria and Tony is also a real honor. So just wanted to say a huge merci, thank you, I, Mr. Hay, for allowing me to join this conversation. I'm seeing some names sort of in the chat that I recognize, so hello everybody. And I guess finally, I just want to get this out of the way. I'm quite nervous. Métis identity is not really something that's necessarily in my wheelhouse. So I guess to be really straightforward, I am interested in having a conversation from my own perspective as an individual, as somebody who grew up in my particular circumstances in sort of southern Alberta, where my family comes predominantly from, northern Montana, southern Saskatchewan, southern Alberta is most of where we spend our time. And also I'm really interested in being descriptive. When we're talking about these issues, when we're forwarding possible solutions or sharing our opinions on things, nothing that I say in particular is meant to be prescriptive at all. Like, I'm not saying this is how we have to do it, this is how we should be doing it, as though I'm some kind of, expert or authority on any of this. I'm really interested in sort of putting out ideas, and if other folks are interested in them, please pick them up and take them and run with them. And hopefully folks will get something out of this conversation. So Mr. Hay again, very excited.
Amazing, thank you both. Yeah, I'm also nervous. I forgot to mention this in the beginning. This conversation and how I am going to moderate it is very loose. So this is both for Molly and Christy. And also, we talked about this before when we met, that I definitely want to think of this more as just a conversation. And so I'm not going to be interviewing. I do have some guiding questions if, the conversation needs to be guided back kind of to where we are. But in terms of that, it's very loose. I was thinking about this being like a virtual kitchen table, right? So we're just having a convo. Kitchen table governance, I think, is really the backbone of a lot of Métis governance. So I just want to have that just guide us. And then also for the attendees to know that I'm not like asking hard-hitting questions. I'm not a journalist. But the first one I do kind of want to start out with, it's big. It's gonna, I think this could like honestly cover us for the entire time. In the first Métis identity talk with Tony Belcourt and Maria Campbell, Maria and Tony complicated the use of Métis as an identifier. Maria instead saying she is an Apataugusa Nahiau, and that being Métis as we conceptualize it is quite political. And we've been caught up so much in who is and who isn't Métis. I wanted to ask you both, how do we move beyond this sticking place? Basically, we are Métis, now what? How do we go beyond this conversation? Just a little question to start out with. Molly, Christy, whoever would like to go first.
I guess you're pausing for me, Molly. So, okay, I'll go first. Well, so I've been, I really like the idea, first of all, of this conversation and the way that we're going to be holding it. When I was asked if I would come on this panel, first of all, I very rarely ever comment on Métis identity publicly in any way, shape, or form. I just don't want to get into it. It's such a heated discussion to have, because the politics around it can be so toxic that, and especially in the online culture where you don't really have an opportunity for nuanced conversations. That's why I really enjoy this forum, because I was asked specifically to come on, and then that this series, I suppose, on Métis identity would be a chance for panelists to respond and build upon the previous panelists' discussion. So in that sense, I really like that, because it's like when people have a whole bunch of knowledge that we share together, then it's not like we're just tossing out individual ideas and leaving it sort of sit there in individual piles. We're really building on the collective knowledge that we have. So in that sense, I really enjoyed, I mean, not in that sense, but I really enjoyed the discussion with my dad, Tony, and Maria. I really value and love and admire and appreciate them as just as individuals, but also as people who carry so much knowledge about our nation. And I really like that they have such a in-depth memory of what has occurred in our organizing. So a lot of times what happens is when we think about Métis people, or when Métis people are presented as a historical group, we sort of, it's like our history ends at Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont and nothing else happened after that, except for within our nation, we understand a little bit about, what might have happened around organizing for the Métis settlements. Jim Brady, Malcolm Norris, Joe Dion, and the rest. We might understand a little bit about how things were organized. After that, there was seemed to be a big gap in organizing. And then all of a sudden we have, the Native Council of Canada and then the Métis National Council pop up. And it seems like there's these big decade-long gaps and so to have people who were involved in that organizing be able to tell us what was really happening, what was the intent behind that organizing, I think is really important. And then to understand what wasn't the intent of that. Was it the intent to pan-indigenize, pan-Métisize everything? It was not the intent. What was the reason? What was the response? Why were our people responding and organizing nationally? And then to understand how things got to be where they are today is really important. One of the things that Maria had said, and I think, and my dad and Maria and I have had extensive conversations on this subject, especially when we were traveling this past summer. The conversations got pretty damn heated, in the vehicle as we were traveling, but it was so important to hear what they were saying to each other and about the identity or even just the word Métis. So let's take a look at that, and then let's talk about a little bit about what Maria had said and what my dad had said. So before I say how the word Métis became universally used, I think what I want to talk about is a little bit of research that I've been doing with people, and how Maria said that she identifies herself as a Nehiyaw Aptigosan. Now let me pronounce that right. Aptigosan. So Aptigosan. So and how she described that is very important. Even though Apta is the indicator or sound for half, and it is in English interpreted as a Cree half-breed, it's actually, the meaning of that word is Cree half-cousin. And that's how the people, we thought of ourselves in terms of relationships in relation with our relatives and our extended relatives. And so understanding the language and understanding how people identified themselves is really key to knowing how do we move on from here. I don't think we can move on in the political framework that's been presented to us for the last 20, 30 years. I think we have to move on first by stopping and taking stock of those words and where we come from. So when I think about that I asked also, I was doing some research on that, and I started, because when Maria said that in the 1960s, the late 60s, early 70s, and my dad, they had discussed this before, about when did we start to use the word Métis universally, in the modern day. And there was meetings that were held to put the word Métis into our universal identity. I guess I didn't phrase that properly, but you know what I mean. And those meetings were held because people at the time were not identifying as Métis exclusively. Maybe some were, but certainly not all. Some people were identifying as half-breeds, some were identifying as Nehio, some were identifying as whatever. Important to this discussion is also the language, because at the time, when I was growing up, everybody spoke the language. All of that generation spoke the language. So people were first and foremost language speakers. So the thing that ties people to identity, of course, is kinship. Who are we related to? Land, what rivers do we come from? What lakes do we come from? And our language. What language did we speak? Do we speak? Did our ancestors speak? Did our relatives speak? Our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents? These are the things that tie us together. Our culture is born out of our existence on the land. This is how we know who we are. So when we understand that we have kinship, we have land, we have water, we have our languages, this is how we can understand who we are. When I was doing this research, I started calling around people that speak the language, people that are older that I know. And I started asking people, what did your parents or your grandparents call themselves in their language? That answer that came back was never Métis. Never. It was always either Michif or Nehio or Nehio Optigosan or something along those lines. It was always based in the language. And even in the language, the words for when all Indigenous languages, the word for when people say, this is who I am, it always just means the people or something along those lines. So knowing our relations with each other, whether people were status or non-status, whether people are Métis or not, or whatever, knowing who we are, it crosses over colonial borders. It predates colonial borders. It predates, our existence predates that. So it's so much deeper and richer than a card or a name on a paper. It's being a part of communities and relatives that are alive today. And it's also having an unbroken thread, even if it was disturbed through adoption or whatever, but it still remains unbroken to the richness of how we saw ourselves, how we see ourselves based on language, land, and kinship. And all of those things, if we don't have those things, we don't have an identity. So that's what I wanted to say. When you say moving on from, first I have to go back and I have to look at what happened in our organizations that made it pan-Métisized. How did that happen? Because a lot of the complications that we are facing today come from the disconnection, the dispossession of us from our lands and our languages. Because when you know your language, when you know your lands, when you know your people, when you know your kinship, then you know who you are. And there is no confusion. So we have us as we know ourselves, And then we have the conflict of the colonial system, which has put the word Métis, like that has universalized the word Métis according to Métis rights, but we still organize ourselves according to colonial structures. So we are in conflict with ourselves in that way. So I think I'll leave it there. I thank you for allowing me to have that extended sort of time to say that I can't answer your question about going forward until we look back. And if there is time, I'd like to further talk about some of the organizing that I witnessed when I was younger, but I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Yes, that was awesome. I love that sort of three-prong, the land, language, and kinship. I think just to expand maybe on a little bit on that, what you sort of brought up as you were speaking for me was, we have lands, we have languages, and we have different kinds of kinships depending on where we are, right? I think one of the things that I think has become increasingly clear for me as I've gone through life is that one of the primary drives of colonialism is standardization, to make everything standard, to make everything pan, right? To homogenize as much as possible, and then taxonomization, right? How do we structure ourselves? How do we put labels on things? Let's put labels on this, and all of these categories, they're discrete. So if you are Métis, you're only Métis, and you can't be this other thing. So if you're Métis and you're in a Métis organization, that organization can't have non-status Indians in it. It can only be Métis, and we have to define what that means, and we have to concretize it and put that label on it. And Maria was saying in the last conversation, back in the day, everybody was organizing together, but you knew who you were, right? But you didn't need to make those distinctions among your relatives or among the people that you were organizing with or in these political organizations. But the state has sort of caused us over the years to, in a lot of ways, shrink ourselves and to do colonialism's work for it by determining these sort of concrete, discrete borders to our peoplehood that doesn't reflect, again, historically how we understood ourselves, how we understood our languages, how we understood our place on the land and our place within our webs of kinship. And I think, part of that, I vacillate on the sort of Métis thing, because on the one hand, I really agree with you, Christy. And I'm very anti-standardization. My grandfather, really, it was only in the last few decades of his life that he started identifying as Métis. From what I remember when I was a kid, he always referred to himself as a half-breed primarily. But I do remember sort of researching the genesis of the Métis Nation of Alberta and the Métis Association of Alberta. And my understanding is that the sort of executive of the MAA determined collectively, and I'm sure in conversation with the government as well, to move away from the term half-breed and to take up Métis, because even by the late 20s, early 30s, half-breed was primarily used against the Métis as a pejorative, right? And even if we didn't necessarily understand ourselves that way, but I remember growing up and, like white people called you a half-breed, like, they weren't doing it as a compliment, right? Still today too. But it's really important to also recognize the political context of that time too, where dominant society didn't see Métis people as a people at all, right? The miscegenation anxiety, this idea of racial intermixing and race science really coalesced into believing that, sort of the dominant narrative of who Métis we're sort of this degenerate, like half this, half that, we're unsuited to modern life, we can't, assimilate properly, we'll never make it, we're dying out. And the MAA, the executive, really had to navigate and negotiate what is a really different political context from what we're dealing with today. And so, I think one of the things I'm sure it's going to come up again and again is that even though now we can look back on this and be like, was that the right decision? Was that the right move to make? Like, we don't really necessarily agree with that today. We wouldn't be where we are today without the decisions that were made in those particular historical and political contexts. And I mean, Christy, you're obviously doing that contextualizing work. But I think, especially for myself, the more I've learned, I think the more, empathy and understanding I've gained. I think it's really easy to become angry when you see some of the decisions that have been made or are being made, and sort of the state of the nation, if you will. And it can feel really frustrating sometimes, but, I think the more you learn about those times and what people were dealing with and what people had to negotiate to get to where we are, it's both fascinating, and it provides a lot of perspective. I think right now we're in an amazing place because we can look back on 2 centuries of Métis political organizing, Métis peoplehood, Métis kinships, lands, languages, and we have that knowledge, that collective knowledge, that wisdom and that power and that organizing, and we can determine where we want to go from here in ways that don't erase or don't demonize what's come before, but that builds on it and takes its inspiration from it, as well as that perspective. I think, yeah, that's my notes.
I want to just say something about what you were saying about the organizing. So I just wanted to say that in my memory, coming from the 1970s and 80s, watching, like having a first row, was that a front row seat at the at the show? It was a time when there was a very large population of non-status First Nations people. If you weren't born back then or you didn't live back then, it's really hard to kind of describe how it was, but it was very much like First Nations, non-status people and Métis people, the issues that we were facing were the same. We're talking
Yes.
about, people getting taken in 60 scoops, people in urban centers not having proper housing, people in communities not having proper housing or no housing. The poverty was, debilitating. There was lots of violence, still is, against our people and whatnot. And then for non-status people, before Bill C-31 in 1985, the population, it made more sense for us to join forces because a lot of our issues were the same. And so the idea of these organizations came from not as an attempt to pan-indigenize or pan-Métis-ize anyone or anything. They were born out of political expediency and necessity to fight for our rights, to fight for our people, to fight for, the land, as Maria had said. That was the whole point, because everyone was being dispossessed from the land, and nobody had their land. And, still there's great mysteries surrounding what happened to the scrip land, and so then when Bill C-31 came in, many First Nations people were able then to regain their status. And a lot of First Nations people, there's kind of a misinterpretation of, or misunderstanding that people were kicked out of status just because of their because it was like an Indigenous woman marrying a non-Indigenous person, but it could have been a person marrying a non-status person.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the case of my daughter's grandparents, her grandpa lost his status when they moved from when his dad, her great grandpa, wanted to open a business off reserve. He had to enfranchise, and at that time it was voluntary that you could get off of First Nations enrollment. And then when he enfranchised, his wife, who was also status from the same community, lost her status immediately, and so did the children. Then when Gina's grandpa married his wife, her grandma, who was status from his reserve, she lost her status because he was non-status. And it went like that down the line until 1985, when they were able to regain their status. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about the numbers and why people organized the way that they did nationally. But I just wanted to put that out there, that there was a purpose for it. And then when people, after Bill C-31, 1985, things changed. And then the Métis National Council came out of that. And then the thing that gets me about our organizations, though, is that, well, lots of things do, but I don't really want to get into some of that stuff. I want to get into how are we organizing ourselves now, and what are some of the ideas or alternatives. Like right now, we organize ourselves according to colonial borders, according to provinces, and so, I know, Molly, when you and I talked on the phone, we were kind of excited to talk about the fact that the MMF left the MNC. And I know that's kind of like a hot topic, but I wanted to talk about it because I don't necessarily think that it's a bad thing. And the reason why is it's not out of spite or anything negative that I think that way. It's because I see that the idea that people who are looking at their own kinship, Red River kinship, people who are looking at their own languages, their own land that they come from the Red River, from the language groups that they come from, heavily Michif based, Anishinaabe, a lot of Anishinaabe mixed in with the Cree. It's not so much Cree like it is from Lac Saint Anne, where that's 90% Cree and a little bit of French or whatever. But in Manitoba, it's different. So the people there are wanting that authenticity. They're wanting to understand who they are as Red River people. And I respect and actually admire it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, wanting to sort of go in your own direction. When we talk about Tepemsoin, our freedom, our liberty, that's a word that I really have been studying a lot because I really love that word. The idea that it's not just we own ourselves, the idea of freedom, of liberty. When we talk about decolonization, isn't that what we're talking about? Freedom, liberty, the idea that we own ourselves, that we can determine for ourselves. Isn't that what we've always been as Métis people? We've always been that way. So the fact that Red River people want to determine for themselves is perfectly fine with me. I admire it. The only thing that I have a problem with, I suppose, is that they pulled the whole province of Manitoba out, which doesn't fit necessarily with the kinship ties of Red River only. They pulled the North out, and I don't know if the North identifies as Red River either. So, and then what about the people who live outside the provincial borders? They weren't given that option to join in with the Red River people because we're at conflict with ourselves when we organize by provincial borders, by colonial structures. We're also at conflict with ourselves when we organize by registered corporations with the Canadian government. So I think about what is our alternatives? How can we reorganize ourselves? I think the time is now, especially since we are facing such pretty dire situations when it comes to climate change, the climate crisis, and the ongoing violence towards our people. I feel like the time is really now, and young people, from the voices that I've heard, the strong voices that I've heard, don't want to be cozying up to the police at this time. They do not want to be, they want to be engaged in decolonization. They want to be learning and practicing traditional things, returning to the land, learning the languages. And this is what I'm hearing from young people, that they want an end to fossil fuel consumption, and they want the future to be clean and bright. And so our political organizations are not responding in a way that is setting us up for the future because we aren't structured properly. So the structure that was created was a response to what was needed then, and now we're here. And my dad always says those things were set up as provisional councils, provisional governments. And when we talk about Louis Riel's government, that was a provisional government, meaning we can change it. We can move away from what we've been presented. We don't have to feel married to these structures that we're in right now. And that's what excites me, because when we talk about governance, then we can talk about like different kinds of governance. It wasn't just the buffalo hunts, you know, that wasn't the only, that was not the only governance that we had. What about trapline governance? What about when you're, you know, when you're living in the bush and you're in your wintering spots? There's a different kind of a governance that's there. We often don't understand the role of women and just how women made the decisions. Women decided things. They had their eye on everything. They knew what was going to happen. They could see, you know, and we don't have we have our communities and our ways are so, and our organizing is so patriarchal. So there's things that are exciting me, seeing the changes, but it's not moving fast enough for me. But I just wanted to say all that.
Yeah. I think I'm a little more cynical as to I guess, what has engendered the MMF leaving, but I similarly believe that it is a real opportunity for us. And it makes me sad when people are upset that this has all gone down. I absolutely understand, you know, this can be really upsetting, right? It absolutely, it's a big shift. And it really is indicative of the tensions and the fractures that exist like among our people and among our, particularly, I guess, our politicians, if you will. But at the same time, I think it does provide us with this incredible opportunity to stop and collectively take stock of where we are. Is this how we want to organize ourselves? Is this how we understand our governance, like right here, right now? With the issues like climate change, for example, like police brutality, you know, like the totalizing and expansion of Canada over every aspect of our lives. And yeah, it allows us to stop and take stock. What are the values that we really want to enact in our governance? You know, you talked about Kitapamsu, freedom. Can we be free, liberated, self-determining peoples under a model like the one that we're working in, right? The current political organizations were modeled after labor unions. And one of the big critiques of big labor unions is that they no longer exist to organize the working class towards revolution. They now exist to maintain the privileges of a particular membership and to keep themselves going. And I think that we're in a similar situation right now where these organizations, again, they were meant to be provisional. Métis governance, Métis governments, like any sort of governing structures that we've built, I believe that they are meant to be organic. They have a life, they have a purpose, they are limited, and then they dissolve, and that's fine. It's organic, it's a cycle, and then we bring it up again when we need it. And maybe it looks a little different, maybe it looks the same, maybe the same people are in the same roles, maybe we switch it up, right? But it gives us that flexibility that we need in order to maintain our self-determining autonomy and our collective autonomy as a people. So again, yeah, I'm really excited about what this could mean for us. I will say, I think the organizations they've been doing a good job at service provision. I mean, I can speak sort of more specifically to the MNA. I think the MNA is quite good at service provision, like the stuff that they do with Métis Child and Family Services, for example. I think that's great, like the COVID relief stuff that they put together, et cetera. But politically, you know, investing in pipelines, you know, releasing statements about, you know, in support of cops during the movement for Black Lives, right? The other thing that we need to remember is we're a sovereign people. And if we are going to claim sovereignty over our homelands, that means we need to recognize that we are governing ourselves and we are also governing with others, which means that it's not just about, you know, what we can get for us. It's about what we can get for everybody on our lands. How can we all collectively be moving towards a more liberated future, right? We had a more liberated past. We know that, right? We know that white people would show up on the prairies and just flip their lid about how like amazingly free Métis were, right? Alexander Ross is talking about like, you know, Métis would rather die than give up their freedom. And he's like, you know, losing his mind about it, right? That's who we are. You know, one of the things that I'm increasingly, I guess, concerned about is the conflation of self-government with self-determination. Those are not the same thing. Self-government, which at least here in Alberta, that's really being sold to us with this constitution stuff. And again, all respect for people, because I know that that's been a long time coming. I know that that's been a very long process, but self-government is not self-determination. Self-government is, again, we are under the umbrella of the state. We are under the thumb of the state. Their boots are still on our necks. Our people are still being murdered in cold blood by the RCMP all the time here. And yet we're working with the people who are doing this to us, right? We're gonna keep accepting these kind of scraps when on our own territories, right? And I think, the amazing thing about these coming generations, much more so than myself, is, they have so much more access to information. They have so much more access to be learning about these things. And hopefully, hopefully we can get to a point where young people can go and sit with elders more. One of the big concerns, of course, is, with rising neoliberalism, the rising cost of housing, stagnant wages, all of that, it means that people need to work, wage jobs for longer hours, for less pay, for, with more expenses than ever before. And that to me that's a sovereignty issue to me. That is a self-determination issue. It means that we can't go visit. We can't do what Maria was talking about, to leave in the spring and to go and be with community and go be with family. We don't have that mobility, right? Like Métis mobility, I think, is another really key thing. Like, how do we move through our lands, through our territories, through our kinship networks? All of that is being severely hindered, and I would say like outright attacked by the colonial state. Like, we are still under hostile occupation. And this is a great opportunity, I think, that, in a lot of ways, really shines light on how that hostile occupation, both like how we're navigating it in really generative ways, and resisting it in generative ways, but also how those pressures over, 2 centuries have started to do that fracturing work and rupture these networks that we rely on in order to, maintain and support our peoplehood. So I'm also just really excited about sort of bringing back these values of provisionality, self-determination, freedom, autonomy, being our own bosses. How do we live those? And I understand them as laws too. Like, to me, they're imperative. They're, like this is how we understand our peoplehood. This is what structures our peoplehood. So if we are going to continue to understand ourselves as sovereign, self-determining peoples, I think we have to just deal with it head on. One of the sort of bummer things about being a historian is seeing the cycles of sort of our organizing capacity. Christy, you had mentioned that, you get these sort of like almost like years or decades long period where organizing sort of falls flat. And I absolutely agree. Everything that I've seen has suggested that we are at our most powerful collectively before we engage the state. Thinking about the MAA organizing for the settlements, for example, like Jim Brady, Malcolm Norris, Joe Dion, Felix Calahoo, Peter Tompkins, like they managed to do something that is like almost miraculous, in that they managed to get hundreds and hundreds of Métis people to agree on one thing. And that was to, approach the government and force them to sit down at the table and address the question of Métis land. Right. But then, of course, you see with the Ewan Commission, you see the government absolutely just betraying everything the MAA worked for. I shouldn't say that, right? They still got the land. And I want to be clear that settlement members have been working for decades to get the level of autonomy and independence they have. And I have nothing but the most respect for that. But Jim Brady in particular, like his goals were not able to come to fruition because the state made unilateral moves against us. If we stop fighting for recognition and start fighting to regain our power, how does that change our tactics? How does that change how we organize? And how does that change how we talk about our goals? And what are our goals? I actually, aside from sort of this relatively nebulous understanding of self-government, like do our political leaders have goals beyond that? Or are we now content to sort of be within the structure of Canada? And what does that say sort of about us if we're willing to sort of accept that as what we can get right now, I guess.
Holy shit, Molly. That was awesome. Oh, geez. So I have so many thoughts going in my head right now based on what you were saying. So one of the things that I think about is I always think about this is land. So we are, aside from those 8 Métis settlements, as a people, we're considered landless. We aren't, but that's what's happening.
Mhm.
So my question is, like, how do we assert to get land back? And this is something that we can't do on our own. We have to think about, we can't be doing this without working with our relatives who are First Nations, because some of these lands are shared territories. We are related. So that's why they are shared territories. Nothing offends me more than seeing sometimes, I won't speak about First Nations people and how they behave towards Métis, that's their thing. But us, when we behave terribly towards Métis people, towards First Nations people, when we start to assert on their territories in ways that they express that they are offended by, this is when we have to start to go back to old protocols of how to do things.
Mhm.
We can't do things within the political structures because they don't last. So what mechanisms can we have outside of those political structures? Because sometimes those political structures want to eat up all the air in the room. There's no room for anything else. They want to, sometimes the political structures, in the quest to become governments, they have tried to take everything under the umbrella of the political structure. So that means all language initiatives go under it. All healthcare goes under it. Everything goes under that political structure, which essentially is a nonprofit corporate structure registered with the Canadian government. That is not a government. So I want to be really clear. I'm not criticizing any one person, or I'm not criticizing anybody. I'm just simply wanting us to move away from those and have the door open to discuss what is the possibilities for other structures. So let's just take some examples. And for example, when you look at Haudenosaunee people, how they have their traditional longhouse governance, and then they have their band council governance, or even with Wet'suwet'en people, the limited things that I know, which is not much, just based on what everybody knows probably, which is you have your traditional leadership, and then you've got your band leadership, and each of those have a division of responsibilities. We don't have anything like that. We don't have any dispersed leadership within our structures. We don't even have elders making decisions, which they should be. We don't have youth making decisions for things that are about youth. We don't have. We need a more diverse leadership model that doesn't have one president and a board of governors. And that I think that that's a mistake. It was temporary, and it's time to move away from that. And I don't want to just pop on another label onto a president. We don't have to, because the government is always looking just for one person to talk to, right? They're always looking just for that one person. We don't have to do that. Nothing says we have to present only one person. If we had multiple leadership, for example, somebody who really understands the land, really understands that, then when it comes time to speak on that, they assume the leadership role at that time. Within Anishinaabeg leadership, they talk about that sometimes, about their ways of not having one leader traditionally. I don't know much about it, so I'm not speaking like I know much. I'm just saying from what I've seen, I've heard this, people will talk about having more than, when a person's a good hunter, when it's time to go hunting, that person is the leader. Just like captains of the hunt, we had a person who was the leader at that time, and nobody overstepped that. So when it comes to things about family and children and protection of children, maybe it's the grandmothers who are the leaders sitting at the table at that time, and we just all back them up, rather than trying to say we've got one president who has to be the expert on everything, which was never our way in the first place in our communities. So what is it that we can do to change our model of governance? What can we do to get our land back? What is our next steps with that? That really concerns me greatly, because our land, our languages, and our kinship are what makes us know who we are. We don't have our land, we don't have our language, and we don't know our relations, because they've been severed from these really, perverse government sort of actions. Then how do we, then why it seems to me this is like the root of why we are fighting all the time, either with ourselves or internally or with each other, because we're losing connection to all of these things that help to really give us a good foundation. So I'll leave it there, but that's my open-ended question, is how do we get our land back, and how do we do it in a way that doesn't leave it up to, and how do we get a dispersed leadership model going for our communities, and what would that look like?
This has been so amazing. I've been taking notes. And I want to sit in the same vein of what we're talking about, land and governance. But I do want to shift ever so slightly into talking about women and governance. And so women in our nation have often been talked about as governing the home. And it's conceptualized in what I think is a very colonial idea of a woman's place in a home. And in my experience, the home has been a place of nation building. But I want to hear more about what your experiences of women's role in nationhood has been. What does that look like? This is a big question, so it's going to carry us on until Q&A. What does that look like? And furthermore, I'm very curious in how do we dream futures beyond the gender binary? Because for me, in my conceptualizations, the future of Apetagausen governance, like for me, it's queer, it's trans, and it's two-spirit. So how do we, how we begin dreaming these futures? What is women's governance? What does this mean?
Sorry, go for it, Christy.
Oh, I was just going to say that one of the things that Maria had talked about in their talk was, well, first of all, I have to say that when my dad listed all of the women in our family in the last talk, I really teared up, because our family trees is listed according to European models, patriarchal models of listing male last names all the way up, and then the women become faceless and erased. And I really liked, my dad and I have been tracing the women's lines up and sort of like redrawing our family trees to follow which women had which women, and who was the mothers, who were the grandmothers, great grandmothers, all the way up. And how does that look, when it's branched out in a matriarchal model? And it really is different. The other thing Maria talked about was sister communities, and the research that her and Brenda, and I think it's her and Brenda were doing on communities where people live side by side in houses. When you look at the census or whatever, you might see 4 different last names, but when you really look at it, it's a mother and her daughters, and the daughters and the sisters all live side by side. And so these ideas of these communities centered around women, in my opinion, have held together the communities. We do the marrying, we do the burying, we do the organizing, we do it's like, I don't know how the communities would be held together without women. So I see that women's roles have always been involved in governance and in organizing. And so in that sense, that's all I wanted to add before you spoke, Molly, just to add those things from the reflection of my dad's and Maria's discussion.
Yeah, I will say I'm totally about to go like very academic gushing about Brenda McDougall's work, because she is flipping the colonial narrative of Métis history on its head with her focus on like matter organization and matter locality, its sister communities, but then also just women's governance powers. Like, you know, it's as Métis start to tell our own stories and do our own histories, and be able to share those sort of in a broader way and sort of consolidate all of this knowledge in new ways. The thing that I think that is really coming to the forefront more and more and more, and we knew this, right? Our communities know this, but our governance exists through kinship. It's through our kinship networks. That's how governance happens. That's how governing power happens. That's how the decisions get made. Brenda just released this absolutely fabulous article, basically talking about Louis Riel, but looking at his women relations and looking at his kinship relations. How did he get to this place of leadership? And she demonstrates that it is the women in the community that decided to send for him because of both who he was, but then also who his relatives were, what work they did in the community, how respected they were. Like, it's women that determine leadership in Métis communities, right? Talking about sister communities, and that's persisted too, right? Saskatoon in sort of the early 20th century, it was these sisters who did all of the political organizing, right? They held the bake sales, they rented the halls, they fundraised for everything, and they campaigned for specific men who were in their communities, often family members, to get them elected into Métis politics, right? It's women, it's women all the way down. So that's, I think, something that's been really amazing, and that I've been learning how to do is, even though, all of the sort of primary stuff, all of those white men who were doing that sort of initial, note taking or whatever, didn't focus that much on women. I think I at least am really learning how to read the archive to find women in new ways. That being said, I'm still learning how to find queer, trans, and two-spirit people in the archive. And that is a whole another set of challenges that remains something that is frustrating, but interesting to think about. I think the last thing that I will sort of say, particularly on women, is that I believe that home governance, obviously it means different things than we might understand it sort of within like a Euro-Christian context, right? Like the domestic, right? It's not the same thing. Women's home governance includes governance during the buffalo hunt, authority over the cart circle, everything that came in to the circle, everything that came into the home, both sort of decision-making power, but then also that economic power, right? Like owning what comes into the home, which means, really changes sort of the power dynamic, and is much more protective, versus sort of like white patriarchy and its construction of femininity, et cetera. But the other thing is that Métis women are actually very militant. They're very actively militant. And you see it, right? You see Métis women on the front, like young women on the front lines. You see it in history. You see Métis women like at the Battle of Grand Coteau, going out there, like trying to basically like being like, son, you should rest, give me your rifle, or like running out onto the front lines and like waving their skirts around. Women before the Battle of Batoche going up to the priest and being like, if those Canadian cops come onto my prairies, I'm going to skin them like the buffalo. Like just, the militancy, the active participation in what under sort of like white patriarchy is considered the male realm, right? And women have tended to get written out of those things. But that is also really important when we think about women's roles and women's place in the Métis struggle. It's a much broader conceptualization than what we've been told by colonial histories of who we are. And I think that is something that we can carry with us when we are thinking about how to bring our queer, trans, and two-spirit relatives into our future. And obviously they're coming, it's not like we're bringing them by the hand or anything. They're there, we're all going to be together. But, I think for the Métis again, right, like you see sort of as Canada expands into our territories, you see normativity, like a colonial normativity being imposed increasingly on our peoples. And that impacts, and you can see it really impact women in particular. There's been some good work on that. Nobody's taken up what that sort of process looked like for queer, trans, and two-spirit people, but absolutely it would have been the same process, right? Colonial control, again, it means standardization, taxonomization, and being slotted into these discrete roles. For the Métis, I think as a people, we are really well set up to be able to welcome our, queer, trans, and two-spirit relatives into our communities. That to me, there's absolutely no conflict there. Like our focus and our valuing of freedom and individual autonomy within the collective, I think, to me, it just makes obvious space for people to self-express and to be in relation in ways that make sense for them, right? It strengthens our communities to have many different kinds of people who understand themselves and their relationships in many different ways. Colonialism tells us that diversity is a threat. For prairie peoples in particular, I think we know in our bones, and we know from our histories, that diversity makes us stronger, and that prioritizing and giving respect and honor to people who are not, I don't want to say non-normative, it's so weird, but who occupy, I guess, less commonly occupied spaces within our relational networks or within our communities, bring like that honor, that centrality to those relationships, because that strength and that perspective is so important. We need to get back to that understanding, because I know, people are suffering, and they're suffering, and they're feeling excluded by community, and they're feeling, excluded from ceremony and being in those spaces. And, that's not going to bring us closer to what we're all working for at all. That to me, that feeds into what the state wants, what colonialism is trying to make of us. Yeah, I guess that's sort of what I have to say on that. Also, would you like to add anything too, Sam or Christy?
I'd like to add that, so that word for me, that word that I said before, tpemsuin, our freedom, our liberty. I don't believe that we can have our true freedom and liberty without two-spirit, trans, and queer folks being accepted and fully embraced without any reserves or any sort of holdbacks. And I really admire two-spirit, trans, and queer folks who have been, to their own detriment sometimes, asserting their space and asserting their right to their space within our communities in a way that has made a lot of people wake up and say, yes, of course. And also fighting back against homophobia has become something that is much more normal now than it was before. Like, because even like when I was growing up, it was still very much something that people wouldn't talk about very much. But now it's, it's just beautiful, I think, for me to see people being who they are, fully who they are, and having this just be normal, which it is. And so it just makes me feel really proud of people, especially young people, who have really taken the risks and really pushed the boundaries. It's all due to them why we have this now. And so I just want, and people like who we're working with, like the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, I want to shout out to the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, because personally I have, been really educated on two-spirit, trans, queer, non-binary, non-gender, gender non-conforming people in ways that I wouldn't have been before, specifically Erin Consmo. Just want to shout out to Erin because she's always done such amazing work in that, or sorry, they have always done such amazing work in that area that they've really changed people's minds and lives for the better with their work. And also just to say that I love the way that young people are bringing to the table things and changing things and saying, no, like this is not acceptable anymore. It never was, but it isn't, like, we're just not going to put up with it anymore. And in our communities, we are demanding better. And it's up to the rest of us to rise up to that challenge and be better for the next coming generations, so that all of our children can be protected, loved, and supported, and the ones coming to this world can be accepted for who they are and fully embraced for who they are. So I just want to say that. So thank you. Hi.
Thank you.
I just want to jump in and just say I am also wearing a pair of earrings that Erin Marie made, and they just fill me with power. Anyway, sorry.
For the next 15 minutes, we will just be hyping Erin. That was really beautiful. Thank you both for sharing. And yeah, I really wanted to ask that question beyond dreaming, or dreaming beyond a binary, out of my own frustration. I feel when we have conversations about Métis governance and Métis nationhood, we tend to stick very much to, well, there's nationhood as we talk about it, then there's women, or how women govern, and so I really wanted to ask about how we can, how are we going to dream those futures that are beyond a binary. And I really love what you said, Christy, about how if we are envisioning ourselves as free and as our own people, then our own people have the power and ability to identify and live their true authentic selves, and still be held within the nation. I think it's really beautiful. Thank you. Because I'm just feeling really joyful to be in a conversation talking about Métis governance where we can talk about queerness and transness and two-spirit folks. And we're just really turning the definition of Métis governance on its head right now. We have some questions in the Q&A, but before I go to the Q&A, is there anything Molly or Christy you'd like to say to wrap up a thought before we're going to jump all over the place?
I think maybe just one thing, because I tend to sort of talk about like stuff up here and then also go back to history, but I will say that I take a lot of inspiration from Chris Anderson's concept of density, to understand that, what we do as Métis people is Métis, even if it's not how we did it back in the day or what we did back in the day or whatever. It doesn't make us less authentic as a people. It doesn't make us, lesser than our ancestors. I think that there is sort of a conversation or dynamic that can be easy to fall into. I absolutely think it's really important to know what our ancestors did, to work to understand the context in which they did it, why they did it, to respect all of that work. But I also just want to say, like, as a people, our peoplehood is about our density. It's about us being together on the land, speaking our languages, in our kinship networks. And what we decide to do within that context is going to be Métis. But to me, that also means, like, if a bunch of Métis people get together and decide to be like, become the next Elon Musk or something, that to me, that strains it, because that is not respecting our broader kinship networks. But that is another long conversation. But I just wanted to sort of forward the idea of density as being really important as we talk about sort of our past and historic and traditional modes of governance.
Okay, you can mark this in the point of history of when in terms of Métis identity, Elon Musk is brought into the conversation. I didn't see that one coming at all today.
There you go. Yeah, I did not anticipate that as well. But I think that's a good point, that freedom and our ability to identify and exist authentically also doesn't exist in a liberal point of view of individual. It is in a collective. So any Métis people out there want to become Elon Musk, you have to answer to the collective. Okay, so I want to get to the Q&A. There's a lot of really big questions in here. And unfortunately, I'm going to just tell everybody right now, we're not going to get to them all. I'm sorry. I will try my best to ask all your questions to the panelists. More coming in as I speak, but I will humanly try to do what I can. The first one is, I think, to Molly. What are your thoughts on political ideologies like anarcho-communism and anarcho-syndicalism, and how they relate to Métis concepts of autonomy, identity, governance, and organizing, past, present, and future? Real simple question, just to ease you into it.
Oh, I'm so excited to be asked this question. I've started doing a couple of talks on what I consider to be possibly a basis for an understanding of Métis anarchism, and I think it's just like so out of most people's wheelhouse that nobody ever asked me questions about it. So I'm really excited about this. Thank you, whoever asked that. I think there's a lot there. Métis have both a strong history of explicitly identifying as communists. Jim Brady, Malcolm Norris, for example, two very well-known Métis organizers for the mid-20th century, both actively identified as communists, were both actively surveilled by the state for being communists, and organized Métis people through communist conceptions of, things like the labor union for a political organization, producer cooperatives, to build an economic basis to prepare Métis for the coming socialist revolution, which did not happen after 1917, but nevertheless, that is part of our history. And again, bringing up density, right? To me, I see no conflict with a Métis communism. I will also say, and I think this is less relevant, but anarchists and communists both seem to really like Métis history in ways that can be kind of exploitative and weird, but also kind of awesome in some other ways. So the Haymarket anarchists, who their organizing eventually got workers the 8-hour day, they had a rally in solidarity with the Métis in the 1880s, sort of as recognizing sort of fellow freedom fighters, I think, essentially. So I think that there is the basis for a relationship. I think I'm not interested in sort of reading Métis history and being like, that was communist, that was anarchist, or these people are communists or anarchists, unless they're explicitly identifying as such. But I am interested in how we can understand, I guess, our own values, our own laws, which is kind of hilarious to talk about in relation to anarchism, but how we structure ourselves, how we govern ourselves, how we relate to one another, to the land, the waters, the air, the other than human nations, and what kinds of interplay does that have with theories of anarchism? Can we take from theories of anarchism, whether it's anarcho-communism or anarcho-syndicalism or whatever, can that work? Do that work for us? And vice versa, can we understand some of what we do is I guess my supervisor sort of has been using the term anarchistic. So not to say that what we're doing is anarchist or what we're doing is communist, but again, maybe there's some commonalities there. And if there is, or find it useful, what can we take from that to help forward our struggle? And by our struggle, I don't just mean against the state. I also mean our struggle to repair relations or to maintain good relations where they are, and again, with other peoples and with other than human nations in the land and whatnot as well. So I'm really interested in that. I find anarchism both very inspiring and also weirdly familiar when I first encountered it. I was like, God, there's some of this that like is very much how I was raised, and I wonder what that's about. So I think if you learn about that and you sort of feel a similar familiarity, or you know, whether it's sort of through the valuing of autonomy and you know, harkening back to the last sort of discussion point, right? Like this ability to fulsomely come into your own self in ways that don't conflict with community. You know, the self-organization, self-determination, provisional governance structures, you know, the like almost sort of pathological drive for freedom and self-determination that we have, right? What can we learn from those political traditions, and what can we take from them and use them as tools? Yeah.
That's amazing. Christy, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Absolutely not. That's way above my, I don't even understand the question, let alone how to answer it. No, but I appreciate learning. I appreciate, you know, I think I'm gonna need to look into that a little more and have some more conversations with you, Molly, because wow, that was something else really for me, way above me.
No, and I will just say, like, I've always really appreciated, I've put these ideas forward in different spaces, including spaces with elders, and I've always been a bit like, ooh, I wonder if this is gonna go over okay, but they all just laugh. So that's fine. I do find that Métis, when we share different political ideas, even if we don't agree with one another, we don't like tear each other down, at least in front of one another. We don't, you know, you don't attack somebody for having a different idea of politics than you, and I've always really appreciated that.
I love that. I was like, yes, let's talk about anarchy, but this is just a really quick one. Brianna was wondering, what is the name of the McDougall article you mentioned, Molly? If you wouldn't mind just popping that in the chat to everybody.
Yeah, I will do a quick little Google here. I'll see if I can dig it up.
Cheryl Troop is another one who's been doing a lot of research. Cheryl Troop and Brenda McDougall with Maria. And so, you know, all of that stuff has been really fascinating, their research. So keep an eye out for both of those authors.
Mm-hmm. All right, so this next one I'm going to ask is for either or both of you. Sandy asks, as a professional artist who has supported herself by most of her life, how do you think we can shift the collective consciousness of the organizations who only focus on historical fiddle music and jigging? It insults the talents and achievements of contemporary artists out in the dominant arena right now who are supported by First Nations but not Métis orgs. The orgs do not support the work of contemporary artists, it seems. I'm talking about hugely successful artists like Margot Kane, Tentu Cardinal, Don Amaro, Andrea Bernard, etc. So going back to the question in there, how do you think we can shift the collective consciousness of organizations who focus historical fiddle music and jigging, and I think have this kind of cultural simplification and homogenization of Métis culture?
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that, except that I've always found political organizations to be very flat in that way. And I think that, you know, there are so many great Métis artists that are, I'm not sure I want the organizations to do it. Like, I'd like to see the organizations taking a lesser role, not a big of a role. Like right now we're talking about these organizations, like some of them are, the amount of money that they're bringing in, they're so mega, they're so huge and insular that we don't have access to them, but yet they control the whole everything. And I'd like to see them shrink in terms of their role, not get increased. So I don't know how to answer that question, because I do see it too, like Sandy, if you're still on, I mean, I do see it too, that everything becomes about the sash the Red River Cart, the buffalo captains of the buffalo hunts, and fiddle music and jigging, which are a part of us. They are a part of who we are, for sure. But my God, we're so much more than all of that, and it never seems to go beyond that. So I see it as well, but I don't know what the solution is.
Yeah, I also, this is a great question. Wow, these have been such fabulous. Wow. So this is, I guess, speculation, but I do wonder if the strong focus on state recognition has something to do with it, or if this is a bit of a fallout from that. Again, the drive for recognition has meant that we need to advertise ourselves in a certain way. We need to have like a brand. The state has enough trouble, or it says it does. It doesn't really have trouble, but it pretends that it has a lot of trouble understanding who the Métis are, right? Like the Supreme Court of Canada flat out refuses to define Métis, for example, and always has. And we've been in this liminal jurisdictional space for so long, blah blah blah. So to a certain extent, we have had to sort of, kind of brand ourselves, kind of limit our, how we are perceived, I guess, in some ways, sort of on the official line. In order to, conform in some ways to like the funding industrial complex, right? Like, what would it mean for me to, say, rock up to Justin Trudeau and be like, hey, Justin, I'm building a completely Métis like spaceship, and I'm going to need some like Aboriginal funding for that, right? You'd be like, is it going to be fiddle shaped? No, like, so how do we? So I do wonder, like, I love, Christy, I totally agree. I think the way forward, or the way through this, is to extricate ourselves from the funding industrial complex, extricate ourselves from, and Maria was kind of talking about this too, right? This dependence on state funding. And to me, that's obviously a much bigger thing, but how can we organize ourselves in such a way that we're not reliant on states to do what we need to do as people, right? To sort of actualize ourselves to the greatest degree, right? To be self-governing or self-determining, to have that autonomy. How do we rely on each other for that instead of these external forces? And, to me, organizing, solidarity, right? Remembering who we are as sovereign peoples, and starting to do that work, because the state's not going to do that for us. And the bodies that the state funds are not going to do that for us either.
And how do we get a land base? Because it's really impossible to be a people, self-governing people, without land. And, so how do we do that? Like, that's a serious question. So I know, for example, like, there's different options. Let's just go through them. You can form some sort of a legal entity, and you can buy land. You can, as an individual, you can own land and have it be just on word of mouth sort of thing for the use of people. You can have a city municipality model. You can take back land, move on to quote unquote crown land, and then be at risk for losing everything, of course. So within the Canadian legal framework, there is no mechanism by which we can collectively own land as Métis people and have complete autonomy and control over that land. Even First Nations people don't have complete autonomy and control over their traditional territories, which is part of their ongoing struggle. So the question for us as Métis people becomes, what are we going to do? So in the interim, provisionally, we could look at buying land, and I think that's a good stopgap measure. But we do need to talk about getting our people to have access to land, because right now we don't, and then we're persecuted when we try and exercise our traditional life on the land. Our trapping and hunting cabins are burnt down. Our trailers are removed off of Crown land. Our items our things, possessions are confiscated. We're charged, doing jail time. There's violence against people who are exercising their traditional practices on land. We had 2 of our Métis men murdered last year, just for hunting for their families. So we're talking about ongoing issues around the lack of access to land, and how do we not only just have access to land and ownership of land in a way but how do we have land that is in a way completely sovereign, completely under our control, where our laws are the ones that govern the land, first of all, let me clarify. When you're on the land governs you. You don't govern the land. So I don't want to make it seem like we own land like that, because it doesn't work like that. When you're living on the land tells you how to live. And that's something that's a completely different mindset than the idea of land ownership, which is a colonial mindset, right? But in the sense of having control and sovereignty and ownership, in that sense, control that isn't Canadian control, like we're Canada's laws are here, and then we have to govern ourselves underneath Canadian law structure. But when we're talking about Indigenous nationhood and sovereignty, we're talking about Canadian law is here and our laws are here. We're not in the same boat. And so how do we get ourselves to have land and to have our autonomy, control, and sovereignty over those lands? And if the Canadian legal framework doesn't even allow for collective ownership for us. So these are huge questions, but I do believe that if we were to organize, and if we were to start to really assert this and really think about it and organize and start to push for land. I mean, the Minister of Indian Affairs he just used the words land back the other day. Like they're even trying to steal the words land back. They don't mean it. They're not planning on giving 1 damn inch of land back that they've stolen. So, but how do we do this? And then also repair and restore and strengthen our relationships with First Nations on which territories are shared. So I think that we have a lot of big things that we have to push for. The organizations becoming really good programs and service deliverers of programs and services, really good at it, is one thing. They're taking care of people in the way that they see fit, and they're doing good work in some areas. But these huge issues of land are still outstanding, and I can't move beyond it until we have land back, because that's the reason why we are experiencing higher rates of violence, of incarceration, of all of those things that we are experiencing, of children being removed into the welfare system, all those things, assimilation, the loss of our languages, all of those things are because we are landless people. And until we get our land, we can't really do anything. So we're sort of stuck at this square one. We can write all the books we want. We can act in all the plays, and I can paint all the paintings I want. But at the end of the day, we don't have our land. So we have to organize ourselves and talk about this and start really asserting in a way that we collectively decide that we're going to do. Like if one group says we're going to take back some Crown land, and we want you guys to back us up, then we got to back them up. If we decide that we want to take this to the Human Rights Commission, then we have to fundraise for all of that money to do that. We have to be able to organize more powerfully with a collective voice around regaining our lands. Sorry, that really went off on what we weren't not talking about, but this is it's really on my mind all the time. So and because we're in a climate crisis, we have to be thinking about protecting the lands and waters. And it can't happen on the streets of a city where we go back to our houses at 5 o'clock at night. It's not working. We're losing. We are losing this battle. The fossil fuel companies are winning. So we need to be able to organize in such a way that we don't lose. And we have to be able to get our lands back. And we can't be building things only for them to come and bulldoze them. So it has to be an issue that's challenges the legal system, that fights for our own sovereignty and our own whatever. I don't even want to say it because people think I'm crazy, but I really do believe that we need to have our own governance, not under Canadian law. So anyway, I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, strong agree. And as somebody who is, I don't know, I've sort of been calling it down and dirty land back, which is, you know, we have a little nonprofit, we bought some land, we own it. Well, the trust owns it, fee simple, right? And again, but you know, it's all under Canada's own little schemes, and Canada could expropriate it at any time and we would have almost no recourse. And, you know, I think as much as I would like to believe that there is a situation in which we could go our way and Canada could keep existing and go Canada's way, I think that, you know, firstly, Chris Anderson, this is one of his amazing analogies. He calls colonialism hungry, hungry hippos, right? Colonialism is the blob, right? Run, don't walk. Canada can only exist to consume, to expropriate, to dispossess. That's just what it is. As long as Canada exists, colonialism is going to keep structuring everything that we do. And, you know, even if we were to be like, okay, Canada, here's your little corner here, what we've seen, and especially, you know, being from Alberta, we see this all the time, right? It's, you can't do the kinds of extractive capitalist activities that Canada does everywhere it goes, without having like massively negative ramifications everywhere, right? Like the waters. I always think about the waters, and the pollution, right? Like you can do whatever you want on your own land, but you, in my mind, you are responsible for what you put into the land, both because, you know, future generations are going to be there, and because of other than human nations, you're responsible for the water, and you're responsible for future generations and the water and the other than human nations, and you're responsible for all of the other people along that waterway, because they are going to be getting all of the, I guess, the tailings, if you will, of what you're doing. Canada just, it doesn't have the scope. It's not responsible. It doesn't care. It exists to, you know, strip mine everything. So, you know, I think that's a big part of it. And, you know, on the bright side, I think while we're losing a lot, I think, you know, it's becoming more and more clear that colonial capitalism is, you know, a death machine. And people are, you know, the sort of allure of Canada that's, oh, we're the nice version of the US, right? Like that's finally, thank God, being put to rest. And so I think, you know, as much as it is about solidarity among Indigenous peoples, absolutely, I think we're the ones, you know, we have the technology, we have the knowledge to sort of right this ship. It's also, I think there's going to be an increasing number of non-Indigenous people who are going to be on board with this, because they're seeing what Canada's all about, right? We're sort of seeing the end point to this project, where we all are. And so I think, you know, a lot of it is going to be, I think, you know, organizing, Christy, being out on the land, having that presence, doing that work. And it's also going to be about finding those commonalities, finding those places of solidarity while asserting and not allowing ourselves to be sidelined or be undermined as Indigenous people moving forward, right? Because those colonial logics, they're insidious.
I think this is kind of where I struggle with, how do I phrase this? With conversations that happen around Métis land back, in terms that we have seen different groups, we have seen different organizations purchase land outside of the homeland, or even purchase land within the homeland in ways that I wouldn't say upholds good kinship. And so I think we're just stuck in this, I like to call it like colonial muskeg, right? Of having to navigate like our actual Wekotwin, like not just like our, like as individuals, but like our kinship with First Nations and what that means on shared land. And I struggle envisioning and dreaming land back in that terms of like, well, what does that mean in shared places? How do we govern ourselves in shared places? And I think it's so hard to kind of go beyond the boundaries of our governance that we have now, that is very much colonial, that is very much, as the moderator, I'm just like throwing off my hat now, letting my opinion shine, that I think our governing orgs uphold systems of colonial governance that don't serve us and that do individualize us in very, I think, dangerous neoliberal ways. So how do we have land? Like, I just can't even conceptualize having land in a way that actually upholds who we are and our ways of being in a shared way, because it is scarcity under colonialism, right? Because like you said, Wally, it is a death machine, and we all are having to dream in scarcity, and that makes me so anxious. And so, like, yeah, I want land back. Yes, this is something, like, we need it. It's integral. But I just, like, listening to both of you, I'm like, yes, I agree with everything. And I want that, but I'm just like, how?
Yeah. I don't think it's land back if it's not your land, because you're not taking it back, you're just taking it. So, but no, I agree, right? And I absolutely agree. Like, the boundedness of, so for example, what my land trust project is doing it makes it challenging because it's so small, right? We have 160 acres, which seems like a lot, but when you look at, even if you're going to use the blue blob homeland map or whatever, like, our people are across an area that's something like 5 times the size of Germany. And our peoplehood, to me, requires that kind of space and that kind of mobility. And so to me, it's again, it's not about owning the land. It's not about being like, oh, this square foot is Métis land. Here's the border of Métis land. Okay, that could be Cree land, that can be Nish land, that could be Soda land. No, we need to, like, how did we organize and understand this shared space prior to this imposition of the idea of land as property? We need to go way back to the basics, and we need to also recognize that, like, it was messy back in the day too. Métis pulled some biz, other people pulled some biz. Sometimes we made up, sometimes we didn't. But at the end of the day, we all managed to live there together. And so I think part of it is, like, again, embracing the messiness, recognizing that there is no sort of clean cut solution to this. And I think it's just being willing to trust one another, that we're not trying to pull one over on anybody. Like, if we can start from there on our own territories and do that, again, like, that's solidarity, do that work together, recognizing that we don't have to have precisely the same goal, but we are all interested in getting to a similar place. Maybe that's a start.
That's well said. I think also, like, Sam, what you said too, about the organizations really upholding the political, like, neoliberalism, and one of the things that I'm familiar with is where I live is in Ontario. I live, spend my time halfway between Nimkeojibikong, our land-based language camp, and Espanola, Ontario, a little town. And why I'm there is a whole other story that I won't get into, but I'm just there. And it's in Anishinaabeg territory. Now, there's been some conflicts over hunting in the region, partly because some members who say they are Métis come into the region and disrespect the understood traditional family land areas of land use. And then the province also does the same thing. So the province issues hunting tags for moose. And then because we've fought for our rights, we're all fighting for our rights to these moose. What happens is we come in conflict with each other because we're not respecting the traditional family land use that's been in place for hundreds of years, which, by the way, did include half-breed family land use as well. And that's a whole other story that I won't get into because it's not my territory and I don't want to talk about it like I know too much about it. All I know is what I've been told. So the thing that I find fascinating is that from my understanding, without being a trapper myself, I understand that there are family lines of territories that were understood and respected. So you know that that's such and such families, that's their trap line over there. You know that this is our trap line. You know that this is their trap line. And you don't cross over that because we're talking about survival of people. And you want people to survive. You want them to live and thrive. So you leave their stuff alone. Also, if the animals or whatever are down in a certain place, then you don't over trap. You don't over hunt in a certain area. And collectively, people would get together and say, we need to leave that spot alone this year, and we're going to go over to this spot instead, because it's forward thinking about survival, and within that is the respect of our relatives, our non-human relatives. Within that is our stories of all our traditional stories. Even in the comments section or the chat, Marilyn mentioned that Maria was talking about the what's that guy's name? That bad one that eats people. I forget his name. You know what I'm talking about in our stories, right? That's based out of greed, based on what we saw with colonialism and whatnot. So there's stories about that and how to live in balance with Mother Earth and how to do all of these things. And we already have all of that knowledge within our people. We have it. We have all of the land use understandings of how to do that with each other. It's already within us. It's already there. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel in that sense. All we have to do is reinvigorate, give life to these ways again. It's not a matter of trying to go back in time. It's a matter of knowing that amongst our people, these things existed and worked well. There was a reason why people lived like that. They worked well. When Europeans came over here, you could walk on the backs of fish across rivers. That's how many fish were here. And you're right about, Molly, about Canada existing only as it is that what's that guy's name again? The one, anyway, I don't even like to say the name of him, the one that eats, it's consumerism, it's this constant unsatiated greed of wanting to eat everything. And this is how I see Canada, because it's what they based the country on, was resources. They came for the resources. It was never really even about the land as much as it was about the resources. So this is what we're faced with in this time, but we have our systems. And when we explore traditional systems of governance, like trapline governance, like land use, like all of these things, how did we live with each other, and sharing the land with each other? What does that mean? How did we do that? And when we get down to the nitty-gritty of really how it's done, and we just give life to that again, then we have the solution is right in front of us. Anyway, that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you both. That was great. It was amazing. If you saw me laughing, I was just laughing at the chat. So we're coming up on our last 5 minutes. I didn't get to all the questions in the Q&A. We're not going to. I'm sorry. I told you all that I probably wouldn't be able to. And I didn't want to interrupt the question or the flow of the conversation we were having in our last 15. It was so amazing. But yeah, before we end, I just want to say thank you to the organizers. Thank you to Maria and Tony for having, I think, thought of this series, right? And for starting us off with that really amazing first session. I want to thank Molly for reaching out to me asking if I wanted to moderate. This has been really fantastic to be a part of, and thank you both, Molly and Christy, for just being so fantastic, and just, I think, giving us all so much to think about. I stopped taking notes because I'm gonna just have to go back and listen, This was just truly fantastic. And yeah, in the last 4 minutes, is there anything you two would like to say before we sign off?
Just hi, everybody. Really, really honored to be here and to have been asked. Thank you, Maria and my dad, for. I want to go back and listen to theirs again. It was so rich, and I feel good listening to them. And thank you, Priscilla Campo, the Athabasca University, ex-University, Lynn, and of course you, Sam, and you, Molly, for agreeing to be part of this. It was fun. It was lots of fun. Thank you. Let's go get our land back. Let's organize next steps.
Yeah, I just want to reflect, Marcy, everybody, all the organizers. Sam, thank you so much for agreeing to moderate. You were fabulous. Kept us in line really good, really lovingly. Yeah, and thank you again to the organizers. And thanks for everybody who sat through 2 hours of us chatting. I've got to say, this was really nice. It definitely had the sort of kitchen table vibe, especially after COVID and also just being a grad student, living in basically a cave. So it was fun to chat about. And yeah, I do want to say, if anybody's excited about any of these ideas, feel free to reach out, and we can continue this conversation. And I'm always happy to pass along reading material or whatever it is. And yeah, everybody keep safe out there, and let's go get our land back.
Amazing, thank you. I think that's all we have. Lynn, unless there's something you'd like to add? Did I forget? Oh, Lynn's in the dark.
Much. I'm in the dark. Sorry, I didn't know I was going to turn my camera on. We will probably get bumped off the call. Brian will stop it, but I'll send you all an email